Welcome to the Cyber Kumite. I'm Tim Wainwright, and this is Chris Salerno. Today with us is Nick Ascoli, and we're talking about SIEM versus UBA. What's the real difference? Do you need both of these tools in your environment or just one? Today's Kumite is brought to you by our sponsor, UCBA, the only UEBA tool that captures and correlates your users' eye blinks and twitches to suss out with up to 29% accuracy if they're up to something shady. That's UCBA.
All right, Nick. Usually we start these tool set battles off with 60 seconds on our guest, and that's you, explaining the main difference between these tools. Timer's ready when you are.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is obviously my favorite topic to talk about. So I think
60 seconds, Nick.
Okay. So the two core differences, I think, funny enough, the core difference is a letter that's not present in either acronyms, which are already arguably too long, which is anomalies. And I think I'll explain the differences first, and then we'll get into the details. So SIEM is, you pump in all of your logs from your disparate suites and platforms, and you write rules to analyze those logs based on criteria that you define or that the vendor has already defined and ships out with your SIEM. But usually people write their own or edit the pre-existing, like out of the box content that comes with their SIEM. But the onus is on the rules that are written to detect bad behavior. So the rules are always looking for patterns or matches against fields or some specific criteria to alert on. Whereas in a UBA, while you're ingesting similar logs, pretty much any log that can be associated with a user or with some vendors a device also is going to be indexed. Anything that's not useful to those two things is just going to get spit out. So it's mostly similar logs, anything that can be associated with a user and device. You're not looking based on criteria that you define in the same way. While you can, what you're looking for in a UBA or what the UBA is doing with the data is just looking for deviations from the sort of mean of behavior. So it's just always calculating what's normal for a user, and in some cases a device, and just looking for a difference. So while in a SIEM, maybe you have a rule that says, like, if I ever see who am I followed by a host name in the command line, flag a rule that says like potential recon or potential, enumeration. On a UBA, it's indexing every single command line field that comes across and just telling you when there's something that's dramatically different for this user. Like, this user's never had a command line argument that looked like this, or this process hasn't, or no one in the organization has, that sort of thing. So there is no specific criteria you're looking for. You're just looking for a dramatic difference in in what is coming in what you're assigning to be analyzed, which can be just about anything. So I think that illustrates.
Yeah. It was like 2 minutes, but that's fine.
Yeah, we should have given you 1 minute per platform topic, but no, that's a good distinction. So Nick, when these came out, when UEBAs first came on the scene a few years ago, there were a couple myths about them, so help us myth bust this, confirm or deny. One, UBAs need about 3 months just to learn the network to be useful. Was that ever true? Is it still true today?
I think it may have been true, but as of late, the models are strong enough that also I think the 4 to 6 to super long amounts of months learning periods were based on it takes a really long time to get organized to the point where you actually have log sources pumping in to be feeding all of your models in like an equitable way so that you can actually tune them to be effective. Now the rollout process is a little more uniform and you kind of have everything organized beforehand and you send it in. So now we're looking at like a month, like 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the average. And it also, to learn your network, I think there's a little bit of nuance there in that the models are always learning. So they have like a defined period. All that learning typically means with the UBA vendor is it's not going to fire alerts because it's still building its baseline, and every log would fire an alert because every log is super new. So you have to give it enough time to build a baseline to allow it to start alerting. So you can have your learning period be whatever you want, but you just want to give it a reasonable amount of time to establish what looks like normal and to start alerting off of that when it's got enough time. But it's like critical that it has all the logs to feed all the models before you start that learning period, so that it can be short, you can tune everything during it, and then you're good to go.
So assuming you've got those right conditions in a 5,000 seat, 20,000 seat, 100,000 seat organization, do you think with the leading platforms that you've worked with, a learning period of a month is still, that 4 to 6 weeks is still viable? It doesn't depend on how many people are in the organization.
Yeah, I think the most valuable exercise is arranging the logs beforehand, because those, like, it's most important that the models are being fed with a sizable enough quantity of data to make them effective. Which also I think it's important to address another myth associated with time, which is that if during your learning period, if during that 1 month where you're not addressing any of the alerts, you have an APT, you have someone poking around, you have some sort of compromise that you think is learning or could potentially learn bad behavior into your models. So you've got some user that's popped and it hit the weird connections he makes every day, the weird queries he makes to databases he shouldn't have access to every day are learned into his model. So it looks normal. But the reality of the way the models work is they are always learning. So the effect of different events is gonna have a different weight on the model. And B, there is a decay almost always applied to old events. So as events get further and further back into a user's sort of timeline or an entity's timeline, they have less of an impact on the score. So if a compromised user's behavior is exactly the same, and whoever's compromised them does nothing different every day, then it's going to be more difficult to detect, but that's almost never the case. There's almost always slight deviations, and at a minimum, that user is going to look a little bit different from the users, in his AD group, at least, or in the AD groups he's present in, because your identity infrastructure plays a pretty strong role in how these analytics work also. But you really can't learn bad behavior into your UBA the way people assume you can, which is a fair assumption, but the decay that gets applied to the old stuff tends to wash that stuff out with time. So you don't have to worry about learning bad behavior, because it's not going to hold the same weight, in a couple of weeks or in a month, or as the activity changes even slightly.
So Nick, super useful insights on this so far, but part of where you're going with this, or at least what I'm hearing, is not what UBA does well, but what it doesn't do well. But as a security manager type person, I find those insights to be some of the most useful. To hear someone who really understands the topic and is kind of working hands-on with it, tell me where it breaks, tell me what it can't do. Especially, we know that there's a lot of vendor stuff out there, a lot of vendor speak, and everything's perfect if you just plug this stuff in. And we all know that that's never been true in security anywhere. So tell me a little bit more about, what are the 1 or 2 things that UBA is overhyped for, that, it doesn't actually do it as well as advertised?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people try to do with the UBA is SIM-esque things, or they have an expectation that there's going to be SIM-esque alerting, because that's the sort of closest thing to a big data platform that they've worked in, that most organizations will have touched before. And this is something that seems similar because architecturally it looks similar. It's taking in massive amounts of data. It has an analytics engine sitting on top of that data. So a lot of the times people will enter into it with a sort of SIM framed mindset on how alerts should work, and try to build rules and try to build models or rules to sit on top of the models that already exist that have sort of SIM-esque alerting. And I think it's important that those maintain a separate, a totally separate space in one's mind, and that the anomaly detection, the sort of indexing all your events and acting as just a super fancy standard deviation calculator on everything that comes in, is the most valuable role it can play. So I think keeping the SIM logic in the SIM and not trying to like sort of reverse engineer it or like jerry rig it into the UBA is really important.
So if you're looking at these environments, and you know, pick any large corporate network that you've worked in, Nick, and you've got endpoint control through an EDR or something. We've talked about EDRs before. Is there a choice here that you have to make? Obviously people would want both. You'd want to have a SIEM and a UBA, but if you only got to choose one, you know, the budgets of security organizations, they don't always have a ton. Would you pick one over the other?
Yeah, I think, well, it's a really good question and depends a lot on the EDR, which there's like the overall, the best practice answer to that question is go EDR, SIEM, UBA. But
in that order?
In that order, because the exercise of rolling out a SIEM and pushing all your logs to it, that like the value of that exercise for the analyst just cannot be understated, because they're forced to stitch together sessions by raw logs. When you get to the UBA, there is, you see what the logs have been analyzed into a behavior. So when you log in, you see a behavior, which is like 4 logs that just make up a line that says the user did this at this time. So the analyst is not going to have as rigorous of an understanding of what the activity represents and what it literally means, which is going to make it more difficult to tune stuff, unless they've already gone through the exercise of analyzing what that behavior means at the log level.
Got it.
And you can see the logs in the UBA, but sorry, I'll let you ask your question, but I wanted to answer the EDR part.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Like some EDRs some EDRs literally have a SIEM baked into them, in that they also have, you know, an EDR vendor may have like a sort of local firewall logging everything, local logging of all DNS queries, local process, local registry, local everything being piped back to the EDR host, the EDR management server, which can act almost as effectively as a SIEM, at least just for your endpoints. Mm-hmm. So if you're someone who has an EDR that has that level of verbose logging capability, which turns your EDR into almost a SIEM, and you're happy with the level of coverage that gets you, and you've got your firewall platforms, you've got your CASB, you've got good enough coverage and only a few platforms to query through, you could go EDR to UBA if you've got that verbose logging and that level of like granularity in your EDR such that it can almost act like a SIEM, just with obviously a little less visibility.
Yeah.
But I still lobby for a data lake being present that at least maybe doesn't have the same correlation abilities that a SIEM does, but is also ingesting everything. If not just for like redundance and archival of data, for just the ability to make SIEM-esque dashboards, so that you can do sort of long tail analysis, like UBA and SIEM-esque things on all the logs that are coming in. Any data lake is going to let you query the data. So if you want to go EDR to UBA, you can do it if you've got a beefy enough architecture around it. But I would still argue the importance of having a data lake separate from all of that, which also ingests from all of your sources.
Nick, you made a comment earlier that when the analyst is looking at the UBA, they're not going to be looking at the logs. They're going to be looking at the data that the UBA is providing. Does that make it less useful for an analyst because they're not really sure what it is they're looking at inside the UBA?
Yeah.
Maybe just a score or something that is kind of more ambiguous?
So you can look at the logs that lie under the behavior usually. Like you can click into it and see what logs make it up. It's just simply, in my experience of operationalizing UBAs, the value of the exercise of running through bolstering your logging in the SIEM beforehand is really valuable to the analyst. They're always more effective when they understand the logs that go behind a model. But I don't think it necessarily makes it does a disservice to an analyst if they're not a log expert before they hop into a UBA, as long as they have resources around them to understand this behavior. Because tuning, when these alerts come up and they have to look into the behavior that goes on behind them, tuning that model to make it more effective in the future is going to be really important, especially in the beginning. And typically, unless you have a level of experience or the sort of local tribal knowledge of your logs to be able to effectively tune those models straight out of the UBA, unless you've had a SIM beforehand, it's just going to be a lot more difficult to understand. And it's going to be a lot more difficult, not necessarily if you've had a SIM, but if you haven't had, your team or your folks in deep verbose logging platforms dealing at the log level.
Yeah.
It's just so critical to the understanding of how these models work, that it's just going to make a lot more sense if you have that understanding. But you don't necessarily have to. The platforms are still they're pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, you can certainly understand them with a resourceful crew. But
so Nick, you've really made a strong point about the importance of log quality, which I think a lot of people would have said, and yeah, okay, I could have guessed that. But I think that the real insight here is log experience. Like your team needs to know how to work with logs, not just having good logs, like having a consultancy come in and say, trust me, your logs are good, we fixed them. It's like, no, like, does the team, the ongoing team, gonna know how to work with these? So I think that's really insightful. I want to call back to something you said earlier too, about the role of identity and access management. And a lot of large organizations in particular with some technology debt that have grown a lot through M&A have some pretty jacked up, Active Directory stuff that hasn't been fixed. They've got some real luggage there, right? Can UBA work around that? Can it learn to still kind of do what it does around a super jacked up Active Directory? How important would it be to clean that up before you start?
Yeah, the role of Active Directory is a lot for the presence of users in groups, because they're compared in most big vendors by the groups they're in. That's how their behavior is compared. So the tree of Active Directory, if you have multiple straight up disparate domains, you can still get all those in one platform. Like you can have multiple hooks. With most vendors, you can have multiple hooks into multiple different LDAP situations and have that all coming into one SIM, and all of the users will be assessed based on the groups that they're in. So it has to be clean enough, or the models that are assessing a user based on their presence in groups, based on their level in the hierarchy of like who's above them and who is below them in the tree of accounts, is actually reasonably important for a lot of models which assess based on groups, presence, and like management hierarchy. So it doesn't have to be the squeaky clean. And usually I don't see people go through, or I guess I haven't seen the need to before, go through like comprehensive identity, like re-architecting pre-UBA. Usually we're able to work with just about anything.
Well, that's good to hear, because
there is value.
For a lot of organizations, it's not really in the cards anyway until they go away or they do kind of full O365 migration, and that's their way of fixing it. So that's good to hear. So Nick, been a great conversation so far. Final question: should security be the only team using UEBA, or should we be giving access to others like HR or fraud? And before you respond to that, our final sponsor message from UCBA: stop malicious insiders before they start with UCBA's trademark Angry Engine, which predicts security incidents based on more than 11 user characteristics. And they include salary, vacation balance, favorite ice cream, maximum bench press, Oscar picks, level of dietary fiber, sunburn, preference for older New World wine, and midichlorian count. And I'll say real quick as an aside for UCBA, kudos to them for being so transparent about their algorithm. That's UCBA. Nick, that question again was, should security be the only team using UBA, or should we also give access to others like HR or fraud groups?
Yeah, I think because UBA functions off of your local identity infrastructure, in most cases, there are like separate platforms for fraud analysis that I think a team like someone doing like customer or application facing analytics or detection are probably best suited for, because you're not going to be able to like ingest the identities of, say, like users in your web app in the same way if you want to perform analytics in that regard. So I think that teams like fraud are probably best in a dedicated suite. However, folks like HR or internal facing people who are responsible for like personnel investigations or handling personnel problems that could loop in security, I think a compelling enough case could be made for case-by-case access, or just bringing them in as a part of certain escalation paths, but probably not like unfettered access to viewing all account activity and viewing all entity activity, simply because there's no, I think, compelling need for it out of the gate. Cases could be made in certain organizations, and I think cases should be made like on a investigation basis. But I think it should be limited mostly to security folks and maybe people in infrastructure or engineering teams where that type of data could be helpful for them.
Great. Maybe UEBA is our way of actually watching HR, right?
Yes.
They're always watching us.
That's the problem. That's the problem with giving everyone access.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Nick. Everyone, our guest has been Nick Ascoli. I'm Tim Wainwright, reminding you that I taught Chris everything he knows.
And I'm Chris Lerno, and now I've got an accurate UBA model to baseline against you.